First, I'm grateful to all the panelists for accepting our invitation. So we have 5 panelists. So I will introduce them in alphabetical order. Dr. Ajit Ranade, he's the president and chief economist of Aditya Birla Group. He was our colleague earlier at IGIDR. Dr. Banamurthy, he's on leave from NIPFP and now Vice Chancellor of Base University, Bangalore. Ms. Mrudusmita Bordoloi, Senior Researcher, Center for Policy Research. Dr. Ram Singh, Professor at Delhi School of Economics. Then we have Dr. Rupa Regan Isture, Group Chief Economist, L&T Financial Services. And so we have very distinguished panel. So I'll take few minutes for my initial remarks. Then each panel member will speak about 15 minutes. As you know, there were a lot of expectations from the budget. This fiscal 2021 is the worst year India has seen on economic growth since independence, with expected decline of GDP by 7.7%. But also this is on top of low growth of 4% last year. And employment situation was also not good even before COVID. The pandemic has further widened the inequalities. So thus budget was expected to address 2 problems, growth and jobs. The FM has done reasonably good job. So what are the good things in the budget? First, it is transparent on fiscal deficit numbers by including the earlier off-budget numbers, for example, the food subsidies. Second, budget has given push to capital expenditure and infrastructure. So capital expenditure, as you know, increased from 4.1 lakh crores in this year budget to 5.5 lakh crores next year budget. So around 35% increase. But if you take revised estimates, it's about 26% increase. And further, 2 lakh crores of capital expenditure were allocated for states and autonomous bodies to utilize. Budget also announced a DFI, Development Financial Institution, to promote investment. So the third one is the budget, as you know, made paradigm shift or directional change with reforms like asset monetization, privatization of banks, FDI increase in insurance, setting up of a quasi bad bank asset reconstruction company, etc. Fourth, there is no additional tax in the budget. The expenditure will be borrowed from market or through disinvestment. So these are some of the good things in the budget. On health, because of pandemic and neglect earlier, one expected big push to the sector. Finance Minister announced a 137% increase in health sector, but there is some controversy on this number because water and sanitation and finance commission grants were added. Actual increase for Department of Health is around only 10 to 11%. But there seems to be a big increase in water and sanitation, which is good. Coming to fiscal deficit, given the constraints on revenue, government has done a good job. It also said the medium target is 4.5% by 2025-26. And the tax revenue growth assumptions of 14.9% is achievable, given the nominal growth of 14.4%. On the assumption of growth in non-tax revenues, there are doubts, particularly on the disinvestment of 1.75 lakh crore next year, although government is confident. On the expenditure, the level of expenditure in 2021-22 is 17.7% of GDP. So this is the highest expenditure so far. Next year also it's high at 15.6%. But this expenditure is an overestimate, partly because of cleaning up of the government balance sheet by cleaning arrears on account of food and other subsidies. But one has to worry about the debt problem, which is going to be 90% of GDP. And the interest payment next year is around 52% of center's tax revenue. And also market borrowing and liquidity measures by RBI may also put pressures on inflation. One of the problems in the budget is increase in import tariffs for many commodities, including intermediaries. So India has to tackle the stagnation in exports. It's well known that exports are one of the main engines of growth. and employment creation. So the country has to increase its participation in global value chains. However, one problem is that in recent years, India's trade policy has become more protectionist. This budget also increased import tariffs. But what is missing directionally in the budget is not considering the employment and income problems of the informal sector, workers, and MSMEs. Because it's known that the big companies and large part of the corporate sector could manage the pandemic, but the informal sector and workers have suffered a lot with loss of incomes and employment during this period. So as a result, the inequalities have increased, and government says we spent on welfare programs this year, and next year we focus on mainly on infrastructure. But I feel that income support measures are still needed because of so many job losses in the informal sector, migrant workers and MSMEs. So they still need support. In fact, Dr. Rangarajan and myself suggested more cash transfers for women and urban employment schemes apart from enhancing the rural schemes. Turning to agriculture, the adverse impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on agriculture and rural areas has been lower than the urban areas because agriculture growth is going to be around 3.4% compared to minus 7.7 for the economy. However, agriculture and rural incomes are still low as the terms of trade are not in favor of agriculture, and also the reduction in remittances due to reverse migration and lower growth in rural wages led to low incomes in rural areas. And government has enhanced allocation to rural infrastructure development fund and also introduced agricultural infrastructure development cess, etc., which can also be used for APMCs. But if you look at the overall agriculture budget, there is only marginal increase of 2%. On rural development, the budget has not increased allocations. MG Narega was the major program during COVID for rural labor and migration, but the allocation has not increased. In fact, there is a decline. But of course, the government will say that it's a demand-driven program, we can increase later. And also around 51% of MSMEs are in rural areas, and they have to be revived. Agriculture, of course, is a state subject, and the center has to work within the framework of cooperative federalism. So to conclude, overall budget is good with push to infrastructure expenditure, reforms, including privatization, trying to clean up NPS with the bad bank, so which can increase growth and some jobs. Of course, the impact depends on how quickly government implements the infrastructure program and clean up the financial sector. So as many say these days, implementation is the key. On growth, even by the end of March 2022, we may have only marginal increase in GDP over 2019-20. So on growth, we have to double our efforts to cover the losses and go to normal steady state growth. Inflation worries also could be there next year. However, government should have continued for one more year the income support measures in the light of increasing inequalities and K-shape recovery. So putting money in the hands of informal workers, urban poor, agriculture labor, can increase demand for the economy also. So thank you very much. So now I request Dr. Ajit Ranade to speak.
Thank you, Mahendra. And first of all, thank you for inviting me to this post-budget seminar. And always nice to come and interact with IGIDR colleagues. So happy to see Ganesh Kumar also on the panel. And of course, other friends, and good evening to all of you. So as you said, it's actually almost 10 days since the budget. So much has been analyzed. So, and you have also highlighted most of the main points. So I'll just confine myself to some broad impressions and comments, and perhaps in the discussion we can take some specific issues. I want to straight away start with the impression on the budget. So I think you highlighted the reasons. It was definitely a landmark budget, and let me put my reasons why I think it was received so positively. Number one, as you said, is transparency. Some of the items which used to, in the last, especially last few years, which were somewhat hidden away from the main budget into balance sheets of companies, corporations like the Food Corporation of India, or in the bad old days, the oil sector, the oil sector bonds and on the oil subsidy used to be hidden in the oil company balance sheets, so that it gets difficult to understand what is the overall liability, what are the payment liabilities of the central government. So in that sense, bringing everything into the main budget, of course, that is not to say that everything has been brought in. There may be still some hidden liabilities, and there are, of course, unfunded liabilities and so on. But I think the great degree of transparency, honesty, integrity, and frankness in presenting the numbers as they are. So that is very welcome. Second point is that no new taxes. There was a lot of apprehension that there would be some kind of a COVID cess or some tax on the super rich, or perhaps maybe a wealth tax or an inheritance tax or an estate tax. So basically, substantially, the message is no new taxes. So that was the second reason, positive reason. And in fact, the markets have been very exuberant about it. And we are seeing the markets, the stock market, continue to rally even almost 10 days later. So that says something. I don't think any budget has enjoyed that kind of exuberant response. So the second reason. Third reason, I think, is the use of the word privatization in the speech. I don't mean just the word. Finance Minister announced that the government will privatize, not disinvest, but she said privatize 2 public sector banks and 1 general insurance company. Also, that the insurance sector FDI limit, foreign direct investment, would go up to 74%, or there would be monetization of assets, for example, infrastructure assets, especially land assets, or even, let's say, when you have highways which are functioning and which are collecting tolls, say belonging to the National Highway Authority of India, those will be handed over or auctioned off to private companies or private sector. Or let's say, the removing the TDS requirements on sovereign wealth funds or foreign pension funds who want to come into India and invest in the real estate investment trusts or infrastructure investment trusts. So making it easier. So all this, let me just call it the P word. When I say the P word, I'm encompassing all of these ideas. So essentially, there seems to be a strong message that the future recovery and growth is going to depend a lot on private sector initiatives and private sector play. In fact, I believe even the Prime Minister said in Parliament yesterday, I think, that we must acknowledge the role played by wealth creators. I think he was referring to private entrepreneurs, and therefore private sector role in strong economic revival, wealth creation, and so on. So all of it, I think, is sort of is a thematic thing, privatization. So that's the third reason. The fourth reason, I believe, is, so basically, just to recap, transparency, the fact that it was the second reason was first was transparency. Then third reason I said was the privatization word. The fourth reason, the second reason I forget. Fourth reason is no new taxes. Sorry. Yeah. I just want to be sure that I'm covering the broad points. So transparency, no new taxes. Privatization. Fourth one, I think, is a degree of boldness and fearlessness. There was a chapter in the economic survey which actually devoted to analyzing the fact that the rating agencies, international rating agencies, treat India unfairly. And in fact, there's always been an apprehension that the fiscal deficit ratio, our own fiscal responsibility legislation had mandated a upper limit of 3%. And there's always this apprehension that India will get an adverse rating in case we try to go above the deficit limit. In fact, India is already at the bottommost rung of the investment grade. So even half a notch below, we will go into junk grade. And this is despite having the fourth highest foreign exchange stock in the world, despite having basically a record of 0 defaults. Even countries like Argentina, I think, have had higher rating than India, even though they have a record of defaults. or the macro stability, relative stability in the macro variables. So here we are seeing that this year's fiscal deficit is going to be 9.5%, but this is a pandemic year. But next year, the budget is targeting 6.8%, well above the 3% limit. And in fact, it's going to come down not to 3%, but 4.5%. And that too after 4 years. So this, I don't know, I think, I don't think the market is thinking of this as reckless, but it certainly is fearless, that there's a boldness and ambitious this thing in the fiscal numbers. Maybe it's a new fiscal framework, and we'll wait to see if we are going to codify these new numbers. But that's the fourth reason. And the fifth reason, as Mahendra, you already said, that this infrastructure push and so on, healthcare. But I must say that if you ask me, so these are the 5 reasons, okay? And if you ask me, is it fiscally expansionary? Actually, it is not, because you see the total size of the size of the spending has gone up only by 1%. So it's hardly any change from this year. But the subcomponents, the infrastructure subcomponent is up by almost 25%. If you look at healthcare subcomponent, which includes, as you said, drinking water and the vaccinations, broader definition of health and nutrition and wellness, that's gone up by 100%. There are, allocations like for 7 new textile sectors. We can go into the details. And of course, all this has come at the cost of reducing something else. You mentioned agriculture has gone up only by 1 or 2%. The allocation to fertilizer subsidy is down substantially. The allocation to NREGA is down substantially compared to the revised estimates this year. So obviously, some axe has come on other things, but I think the focus is on capex spending, investment-oriented spending, such as infrastructure. So that's the fifth reason, I think, where the market is seeing it as positive. So I just want to say a few more minutes on what are the worry points. I mean, obviously, I would say 2 areas is banking and the power sector are something that we can maybe discuss later in our discussion, what are the worry points there. One thing I'd like to remind all of us is that if you go back last 3-4 years, the trend has been that GDP growth rate since FY17 actually has been going down steadily, annual growth rates, 8, 7, 6, I think 5 or 4, and then -7. So that has been a longer term trend, 3-4 years. If you look at the investment to GDP ratio, which is gross fixed capital formation, that also has been downward or stagnant. It's currently around 28%. If you look at the export growth, if you look at it over 5 years, starting with 2015, net from endpoint to endpoint export growth is 0. And in fact, this is a time when other countries like Vietnam, Bangladesh, and Korea, they all have achieved fairly decent or high growth rates in exports. And then if you look at the NPAs in banking, they have been steadily going up. Of course, this year, during the pandemic year, the NPA ratios went down, but that's because of the forbearance shown by the Reserve Bank of India, the permission to not classify them as NPAs until the pandemic period is over, the fact that we have this restructuring, which is now on offer, the KV Kamath committee report. So let's not get misled by the fact that the numbers are lower. So actually, RBI's own report says it may go up to 14% next year. So these are the 4 things, there's a background to this. So I feel that that macroeconomic reality also we should keep in mind. So hopefully this budget is going to kickstart a revival process where we get back to high and sustainable growth, mainly led by private sector investment, including exports. I think that's the gamble. That's what the budget is aiming to do. So I'll stop here and maybe come back later in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Ajit. Next, we go to Dr. Banmurthy.
Yeah, thank you so much. First of all, let me thank IGIDR for inviting me to this panel discussion on the budget. And especially after Professor Mahendra Dev and Dr. Ajit Ranade's speech, I really don't know what I'm going to add to the discussion. But let me, even if at the cost of repetition, I would like to highlight 4 or 5 issues, which I think that has been discussed for quite some time. And as Dr. Ranade also pointed out, that there is a lot of exuberance in the market, and we have been seeing almost 6,000 or more than 6,000 points increase in the budget. To put it in a very simple way, uh, the good news about the budget is actually there is no bad news in the budget. I think that's what that is one of the reasons why we do see a lot of appreciation. And in fact, the many of us have been looking at what are the negatives of the budget. Actually, we don't really see a major issue that is coming out from the budget. As the other speakers pointed out, apart from the six pillars that the finance minister tried to put the whole budget into perspective, three important things I think that has really that needs to be highlighted here is, again, as Dr. Ranade pointed out, it ensures a stability in the overall public policy. And transparency, I think everybody is talking about it. And to some extent, it's also seems to be more realistic compared to the last 3 or 4 years budget. But for me, as a student of economics, I think this budget needs to be looked at in a slightly broader perspective. I think we have seen an economic survey that has been presented on 29 January. We had a budget, and with the budget, we have also seen Finance Commission, 15th Finance Commission recommendations. Then after that, 2 days, we have seen the monetary policy. Then we are waiting for, if there is any changes going to be there in the numbers under the flexible inflation targeting regime. So my contention is that many times we start commenting on the budget as if the fiscal policy is very different compared to the monetary policy. I think there is a need for integrating these fiscal and monetary policies. I think the interaction between the fiscal and monetary policies becomes very, very important. And here, I think I would like to bring some of the views coming from people like Dr. Rangarajan. Whether this budget is going to be inflationary, I think that is something that we need to really keep in mind. In my view, I think it's going to be inflationary because, after 9.5% fiscal deficit, and then you're trying to target 6.8 for the next year, and over a period of next 5 years, we are expecting something like 4.5% fiscal deficit. We have been struggling when in the past 2 years, we have been struggling that when the fiscal deficit was increasing from 3.5 to 4, we were always worried that is going to be inflationary. I think given that situation, the kind of fiscal roadmap that is being suggested by the Finance Commission, I think it is going to be more inflationary over a period of time. And it will also, I think one needs to do some kind of counterfactual estimation, uh, particularly after I worked for the FRBM roadmap for 3 finance commissions. I can tell you the kind of adjustment that has been presented in the Finance Commission will not really help in improving the potential GDP of this country more than 6.5%. We have been arguing that we need to grow at 8%, 9%, but I think the kind of adjustment that is being suggested by the Finance Commission appears to be slightly a concern for us. But more than that, in the budget, one of the documents that we missed is the medium-term expenditure framework. And they said that because the Finance Commission report came late and they could not really present. The reason why I'm saying that is very important, since the 2018 FRB Amendment Act, somehow we have removed this revenue deficit as one of the target variable in the FRBM roadmap. So we don't know whether the next 5 years whether we are going to see this revenue deficit as a target variable. The reason why I'm highlighting this is, if you have seen the statements coming from the Finance Ministry since February 1st, I think the secretaries after secretaries, and also we have seen the Finance Minister herself, and we also seen the Chief Economic Advisor highlighting one important aspect of this budget, which is that expenditure switching from consumption expenditure to capital expenditure. and they have been, um, you know, referring to these fiscal multiplier numbers that we have produced sometime in 2015, where they said capital expenditure multiplier is going to be more than 2.4. So the kind of policies that have been brought up in this budget, as Dr. Rande also pointed out, that a lot of expenditure is actually going for the infrastructure. Now, if that is the case, over a period of time, I think one needs to really see that we also need to target revenue deficit. Otherwise, we will be having a large slippage on the capital expenditure program that we have for the next 5 years. Uh, uh, Now, on the adjustment between the consumption expenditure and capital expenditure, um, in fact, the budget said it's going to be 9.5% fiscal deficit for the current year, and the revenue deficit would be something like 7.5%. So that means we are basically expecting that 2% of GDP as the capital expenditure. But when it comes to for the next year, that is the budgeted numbers, actually the capital expenditure to GDP ratio comes down from 2% to 1.7%. Okay, so I'm not really sure whether going forward that particular ratio will come down, as the Finance Commission suggested. In fact, that number would come down to 1.1% by 25-26. So and once we see this next 5 years, it appears that all the adjustments again will be shown up on the capital expenditure. So that's certainly a cause for concern. On the transparency, I think many people talked about it. It's certainly a good move, but even now, if you look at IEBR, that is internal and extra budgetary resources, for the year 21-22, the budget estimate says something like 4.7 lakh crore. So we are still a long way to clean up the books. I don't know, maybe it'll take 5 years or more than 5 years, but certainly I think the move itself is really appreciated by market forces. On the banking sector, this is something, again, as Dr. Ranade pointed out, this has been a concern for the past 5-6 years. I'm not really sure why there's a lot of hesitancy in addressing this issue once for all. But keeping that aside, this particular budget actually brought in a multi-pronged approach to really address that particular banking issues, where they did little bit on the capitalization, where they allocated 20,000 crore, and they brought in something called ARC, and they also brought in something called DFI, Development Financial Institution. But in the whole process, and also I think they try to bring in this privatization as well. But in the whole process, it appears to me that we may be undermining one of the institutions which we have been saying that the major reform that has happened, that is IBC. So what happens to IBC when you bring in this kind of measures, and what is the role of IBC going forward? I think that is something a cause for concern for all of us. On the disinvestment, again, this time we are a little more realistic. Again, the previous speakers highlighted, especially when the LIC was brought to the table. I think the market seems to be looking at as a very positive thing. In terms of, again, as Professor Mahendra Dev pointed out, on the taxes, I think this is certainly a cause for concern, and it also creates a lot of confusion about what is this Atmanirbhar Bharat. Are we really talking about as seriously a self-reliant economy that is introducing a lot of protectionist policies? In fact, in the budget, they almost project something like 22% increase in the customs revenue for the next year. I think that is seriously a cause for concern, and very especially when many economists arguing for lowering duties and arguing for something like an import-led growth. And I think the Dr. Veeramani from IGADER has done a lot of work on this. I think all those studies are actually showing that the kind of protectionist policy that has been introduced in the last 2-3 years is certainly a cause for concern, because it's going to have an adverse impact on the exports. So I think that I'm hoping that there will be some kind of a relook. And on the realistic, when I said realistic, I think despite the economic survey projecting 15.4% nominal GDP growth for the next year, finance minister said that numbers are, I mean, we don't need to really depend on that. I think they assume something like 14.4% nominal GDP growth, and this time around there may be slippage on the revenues projections, but I think slippage would be on the positive side. In fact, they might be ending up mobilizing a little more than what they have projected. In that sense, I think these numbers appear to be a little more optimistic than what we are seeing, especially the fiscal marksmanship, I think, which was been deteriorating over a period of 3-4 years. Now we do see that the budgeted numbers seems to be correcting those kind of slippage in the fiscal marksmanship. So on the so overall, I mean, as everybody said, on the public debt to GDP ratio, I think this is something. I mean, rating agencies already, Fitch has already, alerting us, particularly on the slippage and the public debt to GDP ratio. But as the finance ministry is arguing, I think a lot of bet seems to be happening on the quality of expenditures. So the biggest risk in the budget is, as Professor Mahendra Dev also very rightly pointed out, the implementation part of it. If they don't stick to this, the quality of expenditure that is suggested in the budget, I think there will be a huge slippage on the fiscal deficit, on the public debt to GDP ratio, and also on the GDP growth. So I think the implementation is going to be crucial, but in a way, I would say that this budget is not really limited to 1 year. Again, as the previous speakers pointed out, it's actually giving some kind of a medium-term, perspective. I mean, even in the finance minister, when she was talking, she was kept on saying next 5 years, next 4 years, like that. So a lot of policy measure that was being brought in, I think it is really meant for the medium term, not really meant for just for 1 year. So I think, in my view, we started well. I think it all depends on how we are going to implement. But I think what is important for me, as I started saying in the beginning, it is very important to have some kind of a consistent, fiscal policy and the monetary policy. We are talking about a flexible inflation targeting, but I think on the other hand, we are talking about a tight fiscal targeting until now. So the government has already given some kind of hint that they don't need to follow a tight fiscal targeting that has been suggested by the Finance Commission. So to conclude, I think apart from many positives, what is important is that we need to keep inflation in mind going forward. And I do hope when this the range that is going to be reviewed now, it would be taking the cost of fiscal expansion that we are going to see for the next 5 years. Maybe we'll see a different number, 4 plus or minus 2, maybe we may be looking at slightly different number than 4 plus or minus 2 for the next 1 year. Let me stop here, and thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Bhanumurthy. Now we go to Ms. Mrudusmita.
Thank you, sir, for inviting me, and also thank you to everyone in the panel. So actually, all the previous speakers have already talked about the positives in terms of the macro fiscal aspects of the budget. So it makes my task a little bit easier also, because I'll not repeat them, but I would like to rather focus on the social sector aspect of it, which Dr. Mahendra Dev has already mentioned about. So I would like to broadly talk about the social sector. So in that sense, I have to say that it has not been as satisfactory as I had expected. So I would like to focus that one of the key instruments through which the union government has been financing the social sector has been the centrally sponsored schemes. Also a little bit on the central sector schemes and central expenditure, but mostly through the CSS. Of course, we know that majority of the social sector spending lies with the states, but then few states are more dependent on center than others. So then in that sense, I'd like to give a few examples. So one sector of the population which hardly got any mention during the budget speech was the children. So basically school-going children. So we know that presently out of the school-going children of India, 65% still attends government schools. So now we all know that Ministry of Education budget has been slashed by 6%. However, within that, the Samagra Shiksha budget, which is actually from 2018-19, it's been actually collation of 3 schemes: Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan, Rashtriya Madhyamik Shiksha Abhiyan, and teacher education. Now, the Samagra Shiksha budget has been slashed by 20%. Even the revised estimates for the last year, 2020-21, have been much lower than the BEs at the beginning of the year. So now the worry regarding this slashing in Samagra Shiksha budget has been that throughout the pandemic, we have all noticed that although state governments as well as union government has been trying through different mechanisms to ensure that some kind of learning is continued. However, unlike the private schools, government schools haven't been able to conduct online live classes. So although they have been doing through WhatsApp, through radio, through TV, different ways in which they have been trying to actually put forward some of the lessons. But Samagra Shiksha actually has the provision to focus on certain areas which maybe the state governments through their own budget would not have that much of the window, because it gives a little bit of window to do non-wage related spending. For example, ICT infrastructure, quality, etc. are some of the core components under Samagra Shiksha. So, slashing the budget there would mean that, again, after 1 year of actually a lot of loss in learning levels, when children start coming back to school, hopefully from April, then actually there would be a lot of expenditure in terms of, improving school infrastructure and also ensuring that they get back to the levels where they are in. So additional teacher training, etc. Would be required. So all of these provisions which are available in Samagra Shiksha now maybe has to be cut to a certain extent. So that is one part that I wanted to highlight. At the same time, Finance Minister has announced that they want to actually improve quality of around 15,000 schools. However, if we look at the budget, then we see that this increase in allocation we can only see under the Kendriya Vidyalaya and the Navodaya Vidyalayas. Now we know that these are already better quality schools with better provisioning of both teachers as well as physical resources. So and these form around 1 to 2% of the total government schools in India. So then we have to then think about the others also. At the same time, they also announced 150 new Sainik schools to be created with PPP or private participation. Now, is it a requirement right now at this year? Again, is a question mark. I mean, should we reprioritize this or that? That is one area. Second area, which is again less talked about, has been a scheme which is called Child Protection Services. Now, CPS, earlier it used to be known as ICPS. Now it is a scheme under MWCD, Ministry of Women and Child Development. And after years of neglect, actually child protection got some kind of an focus last year when the budget was around 5% of the MWCD budget, which was very low, but still much better than the previous years. Now, we know that throughout the pandemic, there has been multiple studies which have shown that a lot of children, because the schools were closed and there was a lot of unemployment, at the same time, if not unemployment, then there was a drop in household income. And because of school closures, many children have been forced to get back to child labor, or actually forced into child labor. But apart from child labor, there are other vulnerabilities or violence against children that have been incurred. And this scheme actually gives a window to actually, provide both institutional and non-institutional care for these categories of children who need protective care. Also, children who come into contact with law, whether as a victim or maybe otherwise. Now, even the CPS allocation has been slashed down from 15,000 crore to 900 crore, which is again area of concern. The third area that I would like to focus on is, as Dr. Mahendra Dev had already pointed out, is the job loss or creation of jobs, and at the same time social security of informal workers. Now, I totally agree that focusing on infrastructure as a long-term measure to bring in growth back into the economy is actually welcome. But at the same time, we also know that actually till the time some of these infrastructure projects would start, implementing and then be able to create jobs, it will take months. Currently, the need of the hour, as we all have agreed, is to give money into the hands of people, because we also know that India is a consumption-based economy. Unless there is demand in the market, even if some of the industries are trying to move back into the growth path, unless we can create demand, it will be very difficult to actually grow, even for the MSMEs. Because some of the MSMEs have, some of the, not in the budget, but throughout the year, there has been measures taken to give more loans to some of this, or make the process easier. But then unless there is demand in the market, I don't know how much they'll be able to actually get profit out of it. So, so I thought that actually creating jobs and was one of the main areas that this year the focus should be on. And at the same time, it's not only creating jobs, but social security for informal workers. Now we know that in India, actually 90% of the entire workforce is informal. And sometimes, people like you and I, who might not be always working in a government sector or in a well-organized sector, even salaried people can be informal if they are not getting any social security from their employer. Now, from the 2018-19 periodic labor force survey data, less than 30% of the salaried and casual laborers who work for an employer have some kind of social security benefit. Now, this is one part of the story. Now, again, the rest of around 45 to 50% of India's workers are self-employed. They can be single own account workers, or they can be employers, or they can be unpaid workers who work in the family business. Now, that for them to provide social security currently has been through different kinds of welfare schemes that government of India has. Now, there are so many problems with these welfare schemes in terms of coverage. Some of the issues have been tried to, get captured in the union budget. For example, they have said that this one ration, one card, the PDS, basically because migrant workers used to face this issue because it was registered in the home address. They were not always able to get the ration from other places. Now that is one welcome move, but at the same time, there are other issues like, some schemes are contributory in nature. There is not enough monitoring or mechanisms in place. So these are the areas actually that also need a lot of attention, because unless we give them some kind of long-term social security against unemployment, against health, or old age, these issues will keep coming back. So I thought I will highlight some of the other side of the story, but I can come back later. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Mrudusmita, for highlighting the other side of the story. Then we have Professor Ram Singh from Delhi School of Economics.
I will use some slides. I will use screen sharing feature to. Thank you, Professor Dev. Thank you. And thank you, IGIDR, for having me for this discussion. Previous 4 speakers, including yourself, have covered every single ground that I want to talk about. But I will still talk about those issues because I have somewhat a different perspective, and which is part of it is supplementary, provides some evidence to what previous speakers have stated, and part of it is somewhat different views. So in that sense, also it is going to be a somewhat supplementary view. So I ask 2 questions about this budget. One question is whether this budget does enough to mitigate the losses inflicted on the economy, on society of India by the pandemic. So this question is important in view of informality of our economy, in view of the income levels, which are well below middle income levels, globally speaking. So that's one question that is important. I will not focus on this question. Maybe by way of responses subsequently, I will express my views. For my presentation, I want to focus on the other question, which is whether this budget makes very good use of the crisis or not. So on this count, I think the budget does a satisfactory job of making good use of crisis. And it does so on 3 counts. First count is, as was pointed out by Ajit, that it brings in transparency. It does not bring complete transparency, but it makes significant progress on that count. Several borrowings by the government, public sector, were not reported in budget accounts, and now on they will be. There's a promise from finance minister that that major component of budget borrowings will become budget borrowings, so they will be reported. So that is very heartening news. So there's a promise that borrowings by SFI, by Food Corporation of India, from National Small Savings Fund, will be paid back within the span of 2 years. And other major form of borrowing by public sector enterprises have been in the form of what are called fully serviced bonds. So these bonds will be serviced on maturity as they mature. These are significant steps, especially government's commitment to clear its debt to NSSF would mean that not only accounts will become clear, but these resources can be put to better use by the economy. Second criteria satisfied by this budget is that it makes significant progress towards capital market reforms. Again, it doesn't go all the way to deliver completely satisfactory performance, but there's a significant attempt, serious beginning. And third is its focus on the growth. So that was also focus on the growth has become our economic compulsion, especially in view of falling investment GDP ratio during last decade. And also underutilization of our manufacturing capacity. So a focus on growth by pump priming demand was very much needed. And the only credible option was for the public investment to pump prime the demand and thereby the economy. On that count, given the fiscal constraints faced by the government, the budget does a fairly very satisfactory job of not only augmenting public investment in infrastructure, but also divert by also giving it prominent in overall allocation, overall scheme of things for expenditure. So compared to previous years, there's an effective increase of about 35% on capital expenditure, and a lot of it is going to infrastructure by way of infrastructure spending. Wellness, especially drinking water projects also have got a boost. So put together, infrastructure and wellness have together, the budgetary allocation for these sectors is substantial, has been increased substantially. And I also believe that focus on vaccination is also important. Once we overcome fear psychosis through vaccination, then hitherto closed sectors, hospitality, tourism, which are source of many livelihoods, jobs, so those jobs will also come back. So, but here is a caveat. If we look at this budgetary allocation only for the health sector, it's rather dismal. It has not increased significantly. It has not increased at all. It still remains very low, I think less than 0.4% of GDP. I'm talking about allocation in the center budget. So, and this now the focus on infrastructure is warranted, even though it comes at the expense of not transferring enough money to rural economy through direct income support, even if it means that the support to agriculture has not been as much as one would like to. So the reason is that during last decade, except last 2 years, we have made significant progress on road construction, infrastructure building. For instance, if you look at road construction, the total length of highways, also the speed at which highways have been constructed, there have been major strides in this area. But all road sectors and other infrastructure sectors, they suffered heavily during COVID because of lockdowns. So it was important to bring the focus back on infrastructure so that the multipliers through extensive linkages with other sectors, they are back and provide boost to the economy. Now, let me say a little bit about the market reforms initiated through policy announcements in the budget. I think part of the incentive, part of the motivation is to boost the receipts of the center. So to give you a sense of this, the budget is, so you can look at the last bar. So the bar gives figures in lakh crore. So the yellow bar, it gives you, orange color bar gives you the expected tax receipts, and blue and purple give you sense of what government expects by way of non-tax receipts and non-debt capital receipts. So I feel on count of expected tax receipts, I think actual performance is likely to be better than what is projected here in budget numbers. But worry is on account of non-tax receipts. So on that count, I think there are past performance, past experience leaves much to be desired. And therefore, that I think is one reason why government has focused on, why the budget talks about monetization of assets and also divestment. And Ajit mentioned that it's bold in the sense that it's perhaps for the first time that finance minister has used word privatization while presenting a budget. So in that sense, it's a bold budget. But I think this boldness comes out of compulsion that is created by the crisis, and since the response is appropriate response, I think it's a good use of the crisis. But there are independent market reforms that are initiated. For instance, setting up a bad bank was really needed. Several of us have been arguing for it. And setting of bad bank would mean that the present account books of commercial banks, scheduled commercial banks, will become cleaner, and as a result, they will be able to lend onwards. Today, they have limited constraint, they have limited capacity to lend, even if there are takers. It's true that there are very few takers, but part of the reason is NPAs on their accounts. Also, setting up also government's decision to invite private investment in infrastructure is welcome. Some of it will come through development finance institution. This is going to be in both, I think, Bad Bank and DFI. Both will be set up and managed in a what can be called in a PPP mode. So not only that expertise will come from private sector, a lot of funding will also come for private sector, and so through this process, private funding will be used as to leverage to attract private funding in the investment. And private funding in investment is very much needed, even though I said that the budget has made fairly generous allocation towards infrastructure, but budgetary allocation amounts to 2.5% of GDP. They are well short of government's objective for national infrastructure pipeline, which expects around 10% of GDP being invested in social and physical infrastructure. And there also government has to take a lion's share, because state governments are not in a position today to do heavy lifting. They can't do any lifting at all. Private sector hopefully will respond these initiatives, but everything taken together, we are going to fall short of the investment targets in infrastructure pipeline. And there are areas of concern. On one hand, FDI norms have been liberalized for insurance sector. At the same time, we force our own insurance companies to invest at least 50% of their investment in government securities, which is really inefficient use of those funds. It's the pension funds, insurance companies, domestically and also from abroad. They have the money for long-term investment, and the asset liability matching is good between infrastructure projects on one hand and the assets of these insurance and pension funds. But we are doing completely opposite. But with the help of these reforms, hopefully there'll be some progress, and we will inch towards what we want to achieve as an economy. Finally, I take 2 minutes to list areas of concerns. One major area of concern I have listed is that we are not making good use of our funds with the insurance companies and pension funds. The other is that the regulatory and contractual issues still remain bane of infrastructure investment. So because of vagueness in contracts, regulatory uncertainty, and also political uncertainty, the investment in Indian infrastructure projects is unnecessarily risky. That means that that also explains part of the NPA situation. So projects that could have been completed sooner do not get completed, suffer from delays, suffer from cost overrun, and therefore the entire investment becomes vulnerable to becoming NPA. So this issue requires more attention, much more attention of the government. The other issues would be on account of higher fiscal deficit numbers. I must add that these numbers for present fiscal year, 9.5% of GDP, and for next fiscal year, which is about 6.8% of GDP, they look higher than they would have looked if government didn't opt for the transparency. So in that sense, these numbers are not that scary. But concern is that if divestment and monetization programs do not get executed as they are planned, then fiscal deficit will go up and can become a source of concern, and then can potentially cause concerns on account of inflation as well. If that happens, then, and unless regulatory in contractual issues are sorted, the problem of NPA can become worse. So these are areas of concern. Also, on one hand, budget has brought in transparency, but at the same time, it's a commitment through legislative mechanism has been diluted. Now, as was pointed out earlier, so there's a commitment to bring back fiscal deficit to about 4.5%, I think, but that too after 2 years. And once you amend Fiscal Responsibility Management Act, then one can go down a slippery slope. That is also a concern. And we also have to watch out for what happens vis-a-vis rural economy. This time, last year, this fiscal year, agriculture, rural economy become a savior grace on account that agriculture did well, and also through MNREGA and direct income transfers, the rural demand and rural economy provided some cushion. But reverse, it has witnessed reverse migration, and that can play out to weaken our economic strengths that emanate from rural areas. So I will stop here and will be happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Ram Singh. Now we move to Dr. Rupa. Sorry to keep you waiting. Dr. Rupa? Yeah.
Yes. Thank you very much, Professor Dev and IGIDR. Being the last speaker in this conference is certainly very challenging. But at this stage of my life, I can't do much about the alphabetical disadvantage. So I will just give my own take on the budget. Most of the points are covered. I think this year's budget, the preparation of budget was very challenging against the backdrop of this health pandemic. And it was really a rare kind of historic event. And more than that, we had entered the pandemic in a very fragile state, whether in terms of our economic growth, which was at the decade's lowest point, or stresses in the financial sector, or fiscal position. So against that backdrop, I think the budget's response to the economic shock was very decent, primarily for three things. Its strong push to capex, its attempt to restore transparency and credibility to budget maths, and thirdly, of course, its conservative revenue assumptions. I think for last several years, we have not seen such realistic assumptions about revenue generation. And this kind of fiscal response was necessitated by a huge revenue shortfall in the current fiscal year, that is FY21, which was of the magnitude of 4.65 trillion rupees. It is really massive. So if the government had tried to control fiscal deficit at this stage, it would have required a very sharp increase in taxes and a sharp reduction in expenditures, which would have slowed or even arrested the ongoing economic recovery. But while doing this, the government has taken a major risk to increase its debt burden to prevent our economy from slipping into protracted recession. So, but personally, I feel that the kind of strong capex push the budget has given, if projects get implemented and executed at the in a timely fashion, then it has potential to speed up the process of economic recovery. And over the medium term, it may lessen the rising debt to GDP ratio. But then everything hinges on how the growth trajectory pans out. And for that, government will have to come out with this kind of a support unless private investment starts growing in a sustainable fashion. So it's not a one-off, it's kind of an action. They will have to closely monitor and maintain the quality of fiscal spending. So positives of this budget are, of course, the push that it has given to infra spending, no incremental tax burden on persons as well as on companies, and the transparency aspect. The whole food subsidy bill is included openly in budget, and the reliance on off-budgetary borrowings is also reduced considerably. I think these are very strongly positive aspects. But then there are certain concerns. First of all, the over-reliance on disinvestments, because we have seen that, the actual receipts from disinvestments in last many years have always fallen short of targets. And the government this year has come out with a policy of selling all PSUs in non-strategic sectors and keeping the number of PSUs in 4 strategic sectors to a bare minimum. I think that's a huge task. It is also confident that the 4 PSUs, including Air India, BPCL, that were scheduled for strategic sale this year, will finally be sold off next year. So we need to watch that. Also, the IPO of LIC and special purpose vehicle to sell surplus land, that also found place in budget speech. I think this is over ambitious. Another thing, I think not much discussion has happened today, is that the budget has proposed a professionally managed development financial institution, DFI, to provide long-term funds to infrastructure sectors. No, it really needs to be seen as to how the establishment of a DFI with an initial government investment of rupees 200 billion, it will handle infrastructure financing unless government, grants them some kind of a guaranteed access to low-cost funds. Because we need to go deeper into the problems faced by the erstwhile DFIs like ICICI, IDBI, IFCI, etc. And today also, if you look at the global situation, even in developed countries like Germany or Japan, where we see DFIs exist, they continue to function because they have a guaranteed access to low-cost funds. So to ensure that a DFI, whether it is government controlled or privatized, is sufficiently capitalized, the government needs to help it either by designating its securities as statutory liquidity ratio eligible, which was the case earlier, or by providing them with some kind of a discounted or low-cost financing. Because as some other panelists also said, infrastructure projects are of longer duration and they earn low returns and carry multiple risks, such as the risks of execution, tariff collections, escalation in financing costs. So our past experience with the DFI model too has shown that no DFI will be commercially viable if it has to raise long-term funds at market rates to fund long duration risky projects. Also, I think there is a lesson in policy making also, because if we hastily do away with any important institutional form, this is what happens, that in the process we lose specialization skills and also the culture. Today we have lost the culture of development finance and we have come full circle. So restart that itself, is a big thing, and abandoning the institutions in a haste also involves deadweight loss for the nation. And I think that's a very important point. Another thing concern is about the ARCs and this recapitalization of PSBs by 200 billion rupees. I don't think it is enough to put the PSBs back on a healthy footing, because as Ajit had also said, that RBI expects bad loans to spike to record levels in the coming year. Today, everything is controlled and optically looks okay because of loan moratorium and restructuring, etc. So an asset reconstruction company, though, is a good initiative, but it may help to some extent in taking over of bad debts. but may not help much for quicker resolution, because banks will have to take big haircuts, because this kind of economic slowdown, even though the growth numbers look very rosy for FY22, even if country grows by 10% or 11%, that will just bring us back to pre-COVID level, which was not very healthy. Another concern is about the protectionist trade policies, which also have been discussed. And that means that, this continuously declining share of exports in India's GDP, it is likely to persist. And this will weaken the medium-term viability of our balance of payment position. So at this stage, going for highly protectionist policies will not help the country to benefit from a recovering global economy. So I think we really need to think over that. As Mridusmita also said, even though infrastructure projects have a lot of potential to create multiplier accelerator kind of reactions, they are not going to generate jobs in big way immediately, except for road projects or construction activities. So for that, we need to kind of re-energize our export-oriented or exporting sectors, and protectionist policies are not going to help us in great measure in that. Another thing here I would like to touch upon is the nexus between the fiscal and monetary policy. But before that, I would like to talk about this exceptional fiscal stimulus, which was the need of the hour. And that's why, we have taken a big deviation from the rule-based fiscal framework. It was necessitated by the severity of economic shock. But then I feel it is also necessary to monitor and manage this whole process in a very transparent fashion and define it very clearly to return to the rule to preserve the credibility of our FRBM framework. To do that, the starting point of unwinding this exceptional fiscal stimulus should be clearly linked to the growth trajectory to avoid getting trapped into inflationary risks. And that brings me to Reserve Bank of India's role as a market maker. We all know, like all other central banks, global central banks, RBI has been managing the yield curve to facilitate large-sized government borrowings program, and to help the smooth selling of this market borrowing program. But we have seen also from the experience of global financial crisis that if pursued intensively, this kind of massive quantitative easing could cause serious problems like inflation overshooting and debt distress. Today, many major investment firms have clubbed India along with Brazil, Costa Rica, Turkey, and Hungary into a group that will face risks of debt sustainability and inflation overshooting going forward. So it is very important that RBI gives a clear framework on the size and the length of its ongoing and planned quantitative easing operations in its forward guidance whenever it announces monetary policy. We have seen that last monetary policy, there was a complete absence of, RBI had not given any schedule on OMOs, which created a lot of nervousness, and that increased the yields in the government securities markets. Then what happened, that because they had to devolve certain options, they came out with OMOs and they managed the yields in the government securities market. But that easing of yields, that whole process, it didn't get transmitted to corporate bond markets, because there the yields are still range bound because of this uncertainty as to exactly how much support RBI will provide, because already we have seen that in FY22, the central government's own borrowings is of the order of 12.05 trillion rupees. To that, if we add to state governments, it will go to 24 trillion rupees. These are very staggering amounts. Even if we have seen, because of base effect and easing deflation of vegetable prices, we have seen falling of consumer price inflation. the core inflation is still very sticky. And once the base effect wanes, again, we are going to see a spike in consumer price inflation. That is also a worry for the market. So I think a clear roadmap on that is also essential. So as to avoid any kind of financial instability going forward. I think I'll take a pause here and welcome questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rupa. So if anybody wants to ask questions, you can raise your hands. Lingaraz, now participants can participate.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So yeah, how do we? Maybe you can free the thing so that participants we can see.
Those who want to ask.
There is a question in the chat box, the Q&A.
Yeah. So that is about one is about the bad bank. Through PPP. How do you do? That's the first question. Yeah. So anybody wants to answer?
Rupa, you want to answer, or Rupa is the expert?
Not an expert, but point is that, as I had earlier said also, I don't think ARC will be able to lead to quicker resolution of NPA situation, especially when the economic growth has slowed so much and there is an overhang of earlier NPAs also. So point is that part of the burden could be shared, but today optically things look under control because of loan moratorium and restructuring. So financial institutions, whether banks or NBFCs, MFIs, if they have again undertaken a large scale restructuring, then it will be very difficult, and we will have repeat of the history which we had seen between 2009 to 2012. So I don't think ARC will be it's a necessary thing, but not a sufficient thing to take care of the problems.
Yeah, another
May
question.
I respond briefly?
Yeah.
So I agree with Dr. Rupa's assessment. A lot will depend on how ARC is designed and allowed or made to function. But I think it has potential to bring in economies of scale. Now rather than one bank or a group of bank chasing after insolvent or fraudulent borrowers. So that whole process can be streamlined, and the bad bank can go after and pursue matters with IBC. So in theory, at least, it seems to be the idea certainly is very good, and I would like to be hopeful that it will make a difference. It will help gradually, though. It will help clean up banks' books and process and improve financial markets in the process. Of course, everything is subject to manipulation or over-regulation by the government. That risk remains there. So we will have to watch and see.
That's true, but a lot depends on how they man this ARC also, the kind of
yes, of course.
they recruit, because our experience in the past is that many times they take people who don't have informed judgment or insights into functioning of various businesses. Then that also acts as a handicap. So the quality of professionals which they recruit there to handle this situation, that also will play a key role.
Yes, along with the signals coming from political class, because all
Yes.
sides are going to be extremely risk averse when touching this hot potato.
Yes.
So the political signals will also be very important. I agree.
Yeah, this Vikash Dikshit, you have a question?
Am I audible?
Yeah.
Okay, so my question is simply, with regard to states, with because budget makes several announcements, and in the social and economic sector, uh, unless states participate equally, um, it's not ensured. Like after COVID, there has been a quite friction in central states relations, especially due to decline in GST compensation and all that. So how do you see, like, because there has not been any increase in tax revenue, which is shareable, of course, with the states. Rather, there has been new announcement of cess, which is not shareable with these states. So how do you see that these increases in allocations, maybe in the health sector, or they are going to be properly dispersed among these states?
Who wants to take? Ms. Mrudusmita?
Yes. So yeah, as you have said, because I work on education a lot, so I can give example because you have mentioned social sector. So as I have mentioned earlier also, states are at the forefront of actually executing most of the social sector activities. Now there are, apart from central level expenditure, there are two ways in which states get money from the center. One is the central sector schemes, and the other is the centrally sponsored schemes. Now the other way in which states get money from the center, apart from grants, which are specific grants, either finance commission or otherwise, which are like once in a while, but apart from that, it's the share in central taxes, which is now 41%, which is shared with the states. Now, because of the shrinking revenue basket,
Right.
even though the proportion is 41, still the absolute money that is going to go to the states as untied funds will be much lower in as compared to the year before. Now with less of untied money, and again a cut across almost all the centrally sponsored schemes, it will be very difficult for states to ensure that they can even retain the current levels of expenditure. Also, because they have to, as the center is rightfully doing, they have to also focus more on the health aspect of
Exactly. That's what my concern was.
yeah. So because they have to also focus more on the health aspect, all the other important aspects have to be reprioritized, because beyond the point, states cannot borrow as well, because even their borrowing target is
Exactly.
or the fiscal deficit target is even lower than the center. So yeah, I totally agree. States are in a much more difficult situation, because, and also it's even more for certain states. For example, I can give the education example. Like Maharashtra as a state, in school education, of the total annual expenditure on school education, only around 7 to 8% of the total money spent in the state comes from union government, whereas in a state like Bihar, around 45% of the total school education expenditure comes from union government, either as a central share of CSS or central sector schemes. Now states like Bihar, even Rajasthan to a certain extent, UP, etc., will be at a much higher, much bigger problem because of this issue. Yeah, I totally agree.
Thank you.
So just to add to this discussion, this is one of the reasons why I've been saying that we need to look at this 15th Finance Commission recommendations very carefully, especially the recommendations for the states becomes very binding in terms of the borrowing program and all. If you look at the recommendations, actually the Finance Commission did some injustice, in my view, to the states, where they're actually forcing the state governments to run a revenue surplus of 2.4% of GDP by the end of 25-26. Now, again, is that they're allowing the central government to run a revenue deficit of 2.8%. What it means is that you need to have larger adjustments on the state government's revenue expenditure in such a way that you increase your capital expenditure over a period of 5 years. So that means, the resources that is important for the state governments to spend on the developmental expenditure, I think, is going to shrink much more than what it is right now. And there is also a little bit of confusion about how this non-lapsable defense allocation that is being addressed by the Finance Commission. I think there seems to be some kind of a mischievous from the Finance Commission. So we need to really look at that recommendation a little more carefully. And the GST, I think, because it has some kind of a birth defect, that is one of the reasons why we do see all these issues, where the GST assures 14% annual increase in the resources to the state governments. I think that is something which is creating a lot of trouble. I think when the review happens, maybe that particular issue would be dealt with.
Ajit, there are questions on export and tariffs. No, you also asked in the FICCI finance minister, but there is no response from the government on the tariff increase.
Yeah, so I'll answer that question, and just in quick comment on this aspect. The education and health, even employment, these are all in the state list. So when we run things like Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan, when we run National Health Mission, Swachh Bharat Abhiyan, all these, of course, Ms. Madhusmita probably knows. So the more and more, even Ayushman Bharat, the more and more central initiatives you start, inadvertently they create burden for the state governments. And of course, it can't be fully funded by the union government, and that's not even right. And if you are going to run it fully by union government, then actually that creates a fiscal distortion. So this is a trend clearly, and then of course, as I think Mr. Dixit pointed out that for example, on petrol and diesel, they changed the mix of the cess and the excise. They increased the cess component, so therefore obviously less sharing with the states. So this trend is going to put some strain on center-state relations, and already there is some friction because of the BSGST compensation issue. And during the pandemic year, clearly the burden, the front line has been borne by the states. In fact, local government, not even the state. So this is a problem area. I mean, we need to tackle this, but this actually goes much beyond the budget subject. On the export, Mahendra, this last 3-4 years, it's not only this year. There are 11,000 product lines, HS codes. Roughly 3,000 to 4,000 or maybe 4,500 have actually undergone steady increase in import tariffs over the last 3 years. And this year also we saw some 200-300 items. And surprisingly, there are items in the list which are not even produced in India. I know for sure because I studied some of the HS codes in the chemical sector. So what is the logic behind that? So it's not clear. And if this is going to be, the trend, then we are actually in danger of becoming more and more protectionist. But that doesn't go well because Atmanirbhar Bharat doesn't mean complete shutting off or protectionism. I think Atmanirbhar goes along with Atmavishwas, which is self-confidence, self-reliant and self-confidence of being competitive in the world and having global benchmarks. So no doubt you need some kind of level playing field in terms of either tariff protection, but I would say selective tariff protection is not healthy. Really, rather we should have a uniform exchange rate policy, which is a 5%, 3% currency weakening affects everybody much more effectively than selectively tinkering with tariff rates. So I feel that, let me just spend 1 or 2 minutes on this. India is known as a leading software exporter of pharmaceuticals. In fact, we take pride in the fact that we export bulk drugs and formulations to the Western world, including America and Europe, where we have to get qualified and approved by the respective regulators, which is FDA, drug regulator. But we do this on the basis of imports from China. 68% of APIs, the advanced pharmaceutical intermediates, actually come from China. We cannot develop this expertise overnight in India. It will take 10 years. And even then, we'll have to continue to export. So if we start banning or putting import tariffs on intermediate goods, they're going to ultimately affect our export competitiveness. 30 to 40% import content in our export. So I think this trend is really troublesome. And obviously, I don't think it's being done for revenue raising. Surely we should not be raising revenues by doing import duty increases. So this is something we need to watch and need to, in fact, carefully attenuate.
And also nobody is clarifying from the government why they're increasing import tariffs.
Yeah, so that
So
day, as you know,
many
we asked this
sectors
question
have
to the
already
finance ministry.
been rendered non-competitive because of this. On the one hand, they are giving support to renewable energy. On the other hand, they have increased tariff rates on solar panels. So you see, it entirely damages the price dynamics of the sector. So, and import intensity of Indian manufacturing sector is very high. So, I think from both the sides, exports are suffering. One, of course, is this protectionist stance, and other is overvaluation of rupee. Because to get, to build up good foreign exchange reserves buffer, RBI has been buying dollars in, spot market, futures, forwards, and we have a good kitty. But point is that India's inflation nevertheless is much higher than the inflation in our trading partners. So in terms of real effective exchange rate, our currency is overvalued. So that is also going against the interest of exports. And that is getting reflected in continuously declining share of exports in India's GDP, which is definitely a worrisome phenomenon.
Srijit, you have a question? Srijit Mishra.
Yeah, I read that. Sorry, Srijit.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have typed it out. So yeah, it was basically a general remark to all panelists. Do you consider the pandemic just as a blip and the economy as also policies to go forward with business as usual approach? Basically, what I have in mind is the first, the 100-year-old pandemic of 1917-18, followed by the World War I and II. So between the interim World War and the post-World War II period, the public policy focus was on social sector, and that led to a lot of other things. So while there seems to be an extra focus on growth here, which all of you have appreciated. But this growth, again, if you look at infrastructure in terms of road, there is a heavy focus in 4 states that are going to elections. And even railways are also, the metro railways are again focusing on specific states, some of the states going to elections. So that's why I thought, is it something like in business as the usual approach or not? So your perception and responses.
I think, can I go first a few minutes?
Yeah.
I think the pandemic, to the extent that it was beyond sort of macroeconomic cycle, I would like to think of it as an episode. You call it a blip, not really a blip, but definitely it's an episode. It's not a structural change in the economy. That was what you're implying. See, and moreover, you'll notice the remarkable speed at which they were able to synthesize the vaccine, thanks to globalization and knowledge sharing and, international cooperation in this. It would have taken 5-10 years in earlier days, but thanks to this globalized approach and cooperation, we were able to synthesize vaccine in record time. Even the recovery from the pandemic, shutdowns, lockdowns, has been relatively faster. So I think it's not a structural, it's not a break in the structural evolution of the economy. Certain things certainly got accelerated because of the pandemic. For example, in the digitalization, the very fact that we are having this seminar over digital medium, and I have heard that even grandmothers and grandfathers have got suddenly very comfortable with Zoom and Skype and all that. So certain digital trends, digital payments, digital commerce, even conventional business models like where the local shopkeeper, I'm talking about metro cities, perhaps not in rural areas, but in metro cities, when the shops were shut, they shifted to home deliveries relatively quickly. I'm not talking about the usual Zomatos, but even conventional shops, or even companies like Levers and ITC, they started deploying mobile trucks who come to your housing societies once a week and so on. So some of these trends got accelerated. Digital trend, now healthcare spending, the focus on healthcare, some of these trends got accelerated. Work from home, the fact that people are realizing you can be as effective. But I would not call this as a structural break in the economy. It's definitely episodic. And of course, on the trend towards focusing more on the states going to elections, that certainly is business as usual. So I think that's to be expected.
Could I come in next for a minute?
Yeah, please.
So it is not a blip, and as such, it is not a structural break. But I think it has potential to bring some structural transformation in the economy. Digitalization of economy is certainly one, but my concern would be on two counts. How effectively and quickly we manage to bring employment back to people who lost employment and purchasing power in the process. Second, how we manage the problem of NPA that is going to unfold very soon. So these two issues will determine the cost we will pay in terms of the factors of production that are going to get affected. It has affected labor and it will affect capital, but the costs are manageable and it will depend, its consequences will depend, but in theory, it can have structural consequences in terms of inefficiency of capital, but also the direction in which employment opportunities go. As to focus on 3 states for infrastructure, it's business as usual, but fortunately all states have elections. So they get their turn to get boost from the center. All central governments have been doing so. So over a long-term horizon, it's okay. So in the past, but if you look at infrastructure investment throughout country, it's cyclical. It is closely tied to state elections. But most states have benefited from this process.
Another thing, what Ajit, Dr. Ram Singh also mentioned, is the disinvestment numbers are government is confident, but are we going to get those numbers? And then also he also said that infrastructure projects, it takes time and also political and these things. So how do we? Because they're banking entire thing on infrastructure push.
See, first of all, in infrastructure, we have decisively moved away from the PPP, pure PPP model. We now have the contracting model. And in fact, Professor Ram Singh's 2 graphs showed the progress in highway building and the pace.
Yeah.
So on that front, the fact that if you take away, much of the PPP problem was on, of course, delays in environmental clearance, forest clearance, land acquisition, but also because during the downturn and NPA creation, there were the disputes and the risk sharing landed up in courts. The disputes landed up in court and long litigation. So we have shifted. I think the minister has said that we are much more in the contracting mode now. So to that extent, I think it is more hopeful. Secondly, we are also doing. We are also the bundling of the approvals. I think that is also new approval that when the contract is awarded, the environment, forest, all that clearance, I think the government is taking more responsibility. And thirdly, this asset monetization. Once the thing goes going, and if the toll road is working, then the government is willing to give it to the auction it off to private sector. So that I think is the reason. On disinvestment, Mahendra, I think it is very, very ambitious, but much is riding on just one thing, which is the LIC IPO. Last year also, 2.1 lakh crore was scheduled, was the target. Only 20,000 crore has been achieved, which is less, only 10%. But because that 1 lakh crore is coming from just the one IPO. So if that happens, they will cover a big major ground.
Yeah.
But as Rupa also said, that the history is unfortunately last 10 years, there's only 1 year where they actually exceeded the target. But that was because ONGC bought shares of HPCL. And for that, they had to go to the market to borrow 30,000 crores for the market to be able to buy those shares. So the left pocket to right pocket.
Yeah. Bhanumati, on this growth, Dr. Shankaracharya thinks medium term is 5%. So what do you think? Because although IMF said 22-23 it will be 6.8 and all, but that is based on the low base probably. Yeah.
Can I answer that?
Mute.
Yeah. I think this is not really a right time to really focus. I mean, try to project the GDP growth. But having said that, as I said, it all depends on how the fiscal roadmap is going to be for the next 4 or 5 years. So we have done some studies to the 15th Finance Commission. I think it's there on the website, where we said that if you don't really go back to your original FRBM Act of 2003, you will have an average GDP growth of 4.5 to 5%. I think that is something that we need to. That is a caution that we have been making. I think we need to revert back to the 2003 original FRBM Act, where you had 3 clear-cut targets on fiscal deficit, revenue deficit, and the public debt to GDP ratio.
Yeah. Lastly, Dr. Burunge, you have a question?
Hello.
Yeah.
Good evening.
Yeah. Good evening.
I'm concerned about this external sector. Nobody says about the external sector trade deficits are, what is the state of trade deficits or current account deficits? If Atmanirbhar Bharat, and it is not the leading, it is going hand in hand protectionist policies. So what is this? Are we going to sustain in this globalization without this kind of with this kind of policy? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I said that the backdrop to this year, not the budget, but if you look at the record from 2015 onwards, India's exports for the year, I think 2013-14, March 31st, was something like $310 billion, I think. 5 or 6 years later, it's still 310 billion. So from point to point, the growth is 0%. And this is not at a time, although of course world trade also perhaps had slowed down. But this is a time when countries like Korea, Vietnam, Bangladesh, all have had 10, 12, 15% growth in exports. So we can't say that it is entirely because of not very conducive world trade backdrop. So
Bangladesh is doing better.
Yeah, in garments, in garment exports. So we need an export push. So as you know, we have replaced the MEIS and SEIS market manufacturing export or incentive scheme and services export incentive scheme has been replaced with ROTDEP. And then this PLI is supposed to be also export oriented, production linked incentives to move production bases to India, but also linked to exports. So, no, I agree. I mean, I don't have a quick answer, but basically exports are intertwined with India's manufacturing performance and also MSMEs. So all these three, the fortunes of all these three problems, challenges of export, challenges of manufacturing, where we want to take the share from 15 to 25% of GDP, and challenges of MSME, all three are intertwined, according to me.
Mahendra, could I come for a minute?
Yeah, please.
So since it's a group of researchers, I'm tempted to share one research finding on PPPs. Okay. So the politicians seem to believe and also have made us believe that PPPs are full of problems. It is true that there have been several problems with our experiment with PPPs. So first of all, there's no getting away with private investment in infrastructure. As I argued that against the target of investing 10% of GDP in infrastructure, this ambitious budget provides only for 2.5% of GDP. And that's all. It's going to be maximum overall investment will turn out to be 3%, state and private sector included. So the point is that there is no getting away, but we have to attract private investment, even in the form of PPPs. It's against popular common perception. If you look at project delivery, if you compare project delivery of PPP projects versus the projects that were executed through contract mode, EPC or item rate. So PPPs have outperformed, in spite of, the regulatory delays. Of course, there have been serious delays, but even then, so PPP projects underwent same regulatory process as government projects, government funded executed projects, but they have been delivered faster, significantly faster. And that's something that comes from the bundling of the rights with responsibilities. So under PPP, the revenue stream of investor contractor starts only after they complete the project. So therefore, they are in rush to complete the project sooner, even though there are several hurdles. So I think one should not lose sight of that merit of PPP. And that is an important consideration for life cycle studies of infrastructure, which we seem to miss out on several occasions.
Thank you. Thank you. So with this, I thank all the panelists and the participants. And I now go to Dr. Ganesh Kumar, my colleague, for formal vote of thanks.
Good evening. It's my pleasant duty at the end of this program to propose a vote of thanks. All, I would like to thank all the panelists, my former colleague, Dr. Ajit Granade, Dr. Bhanumurthy, Sudhusmita Bordalai, Professor Ram Singh, and Dr. Rupa Rege Netsure. We had an enriching discussion that gave a diverse perspective on different aspects, and I'm sure that this has benefited. I would like to thank all the panelists for ensuring that this has been. I would also like to thank all participants. I've been keeping an eye on the participation. We had nearly 100 people attending the program at one point in time. It shows that even after 12 days, people are keen to know more about the budget, and indeed we did hear a lot of issues that have not attracted much forums. For us in IGADR, this is the second year that we are hosting this program, and the large attendance is very encouraging, and it motivates us to hold this program. Plan to hold this program in the following years also, and I look forward to a similar good participation in the next year. Lastly, I would like to thank my colleagues in the IT department, Mr. Lingraj Panda, Mr. Manish Alon, and also the Director Secretary, Mr. Mahesh Mohan, who was coordinating all the event in the background. There were a few others who have been working in the background. I would like to thank all of them. Thank you, one and all, and let me wish you all a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And good night to all.
Thank you.
Right.
Thank you. Thank you.